What makes a king become a legend? How did a man who spent only 6 months of his entire reign in England become that nation's most celebrated monarch? Richard the Lionheart stands as one of history's most fascinating figures. He was a warrior, a crusader, a poet, and a king whose very name inspired both fear and admiration across the known world. In this journey through time, we will explore every chapter of his remarkable life. On the 8th day of September in the year 1157, in the city of Oxford, a child was born who would become one of the most famous kings in English history. His parents were Henry II, King of England and ruler of the vast Angevin Empire, and Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most remarkable women of the medieval age. They named the boy Richard, a name that meant powerful ruler, and from his earliest days, great things were expected of him. Oxford, in the 12th century, was already a place of learning and importance. The town sat at the confluence of the Thames and Cherwell rivers, a strategic location that had made it significant since ancient times. A royal palace stood there, and it was in this palace that Eleanor gave birth to her third son. The birth of a prince was always an occasion for celebration, though Richard's arrival was perhaps less celebrated than that of his older brother Henry, who was already being groomed as the heir to the throne. As a younger son, Richard's future was less certain, but he would not remain in the shadows for long. The England into which Richard was born was a land still recovering from the chaos of the anarchy. His father Henry had spent the first years of his reign restoring order and rebuilding royal authority. Castles that had been built without permission were torn down. Rebellious barons were brought to heel. The machinery of government, which had fallen into disrepair during the Civil War, was repaired and improved. By the time of Richard's birth, England was more peaceful and prosperous than it had been in a generation, though the scars of the recent conflict had not yet fully healed. Richard's earliest years were spent in the care of nurses and tutors, as was customary for children of the nobility. His mother Eleanor was often away, either travelling with her husband or attending to the affairs of her own duchy of Aquitaine. His father Henry was constantly on the move, riding from one end of his vast domains to the other, never staying in one place for long. The royal children saw their parents only intermittently, and much of their upbringing was entrusted to servants and household officials. Despite this, Eleanor seems to have had a special affection for Richard. Of all her sons, he was the one who most resembled her in temperament and interests. Richard inherited his mother's love of poetry and music, her pride and her fierce determination. He also inherited her connection to Aquitaine, the sunny southern land that was so different from the grey skies of England and Normandy. From an early age, Richard was marked out as the son who would one day rule Aquitaine, and this destiny would shape his entire upbringing. The young Richard was educated in the manner appropriate for a prince of his time. He learned to read and write in Latin, the language of the church and of official documents. He also learned French, the language of the nobility, and probably picked up some English as well, though this was considered a lesser tongue, spoken mainly by the common people. He studied the Bible and the writings of the Church Fathers, for religion was central to medieval education. He learned history, particularly the history of his own family and of the great rulers of the past. And he learned the arts of war, for a prince was expected above all to be a warrior. Military training began early for boys of the nobility. Richard would have learned to ride almost as soon as he could walk, for horsemanship was essential for any knight. He would have practiced with wooden swords and shields, gradually progressing to real weapons as he grew older and stronger. He would have learned to handle a lance, to fight on foot with sword and shield, and to command men in battle. These skills were not merely recreational, they were matters of life and death in an age when kings were expected to lead their armies personally into combat. Richard proved to be an apt pupil in the arts of war. He grew tall and strong, with the reddish-gold hair that was characteristic of the Angevin family. Contemporary descriptions emphasize his impressive physical presence, his long arms that gave him an advantage in combat, and his commanding voice that could rally troops on the battlefield. From an early age it was clear that Richard had the makings of a great warrior. But Richard was not merely a soldier. He was also a man of culture and learning. He composed poetry and songs, some of which have survived to the present day. He was fluent in several languages and could hold his own in theological debates with learned churchmen. He appreciated fine craftsmanship and beautiful objects. In this he reflected the influence of his mother and her court at Aquitaine, where the arts were celebrated and where the ideals of chivalry were being developed. The court of Aquitaine was one of the most cultured in Europe. Eleanor had grown up surrounded by troubadours, poets who composed songs in the Occitan language of southern France. These songs celebrated love, honour, and the noble deeds of knights. They created an ideal of behaviour that would come to be known as chivalry, a code that emphasised courage, loyalty, generosity, and courtesy. Richard absorbed these ideals from his earliest years, and they would guide his conduct throughout his life. Richard's childhood was also shaped by the complex dynamics of his family. He had an older brother, Henry, who was their father's favourite and who was being prepared to inherit the throne of England. There was also Geoffrey, younger than Richard, who was destined for the Duchy of Brittany. And there was John, the youngest, who was born in 1166 and who initially had no lands designated for him, earning him the nickname Lackland. The relationships among these brothers were complicated, marked by rivalry and jealousy, as well as occasional affection. The Angevin family was not a happy one. Henry II and Eleanor had begun their marriage with passion and partnership, but over the years their relationship had soured. Henry took mistresses openly, most famously the fair Rosamond Clifford, whose beauty was celebrated throughout the realm. Eleanor resented these infidelities and the way her husband increasingly excluded her from power. The children were caught in the middle of their parents' conflicts, and the family dynamics grew increasingly toxic as the years passed. Religion played a central role in Richard's upbringing, as it did in the lives of all medieval people. The Church taught that the world was a battleground between good and evil, that human beings were sinners in need of salvation, and that the path to heaven lay through faith, good works, and the sacraments of the Church. Richard seems to have been genuinely devout, though his piety was of a martial character. He saw himself as a soldier of Christ, destined to fight for the faith against its enemies. This belief would later drive him to take up the cross and join the Third Crusade. The young Richard also witnessed the great conflict between his father and Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Becket had once been Henry's closest friend and adviser, serving as his chancellor and helping him govern the realm. But when Henry appointed Becket as Archbishop, hoping to gain control over the Church, Becket underwent a transformation. He became a fierce defender of church rights against royal authority, and the two former friends became bitter enemies. The conflict between Henry and Becket lasted for years, with the Archbishop going into exile and the king growing ever more frustrated. Finally, in December 1170, 4 of Henry's knights took matters into their own hands. They rode to Canterbury Cathedral and murdered Becket before the altar, cutting him down with their swords in one of the most shocking acts of violence of the medieval age. The murder sent shockwaves throughout Christendom. Becket was quickly proclaimed a saint, and Henry was forced to do public penance for his role in the killing. Richard was 13 years old when Becket was murdered. The event made a deep impression on him and on all of Europe. It demonstrated the limits of royal power when confronted by the moral authority of the Church. It also showed the dangers of allowing conflicts to fester until they exploded into violence. These were lessons that Richard would carry with him throughout his life, though he would not always heed them. By the time Richard reached adolescence, his future was becoming clearer. He was designated as the heir to Aquitaine, his mother's great duchy in southern France. This was a significant inheritance, for Aquitaine was one of the wealthiest and most important territories in Europe. It was also a land with its own distinct culture and traditions, very different from the northern lands, where Richard had spent much of his childhood. To prepare him for his future role, Richard was sent to Aquitaine to learn its ways, and to begin taking on the responsibilities of rulership. The transition to Aquitaine marked a new chapter in Richard's life. He was no longer merely a prince in his father's court. He was now a ruler in his own right, even if he still owed allegiance to his father as his overlord. He had to learn to navigate the complex politics of the region, to deal with powerful vassals who were not always obedient, and to defend his lands against those who would take them. It was a challenging task for a young man, but Richard proved equal to it. Richard's education in Aquitaine was practical as well as theoretical. He learned how to administer great territory, how to dispense justice, how to collect revenues, and how to maintain the loyalty of his vassals. He also learned how to wage war, for Aquitaine was not a peaceful land. The great nobles of the region were constantly feuding with each other and with their duke, and Richard had to use both diplomacy and force to maintain his authority. The young duke quickly developed a reputation for military prowess. He was bold, aggressive, and skilled in the tactics of medieval warfare. He understood the importance of castles, those great stone fortresses that dominated the landscape and controlled the surrounding countryside. He learned how to besiege castles and how to defend them, skills that would serve him well in the years to come. He also learned the importance of speed and surprise, of striking hard and fast before the enemy could react. Richard's time in Aquitaine also deepened his appreciation for the culture of the south. He became fluent in Occitan, the language of the troubadours, and he composed poetry in this tongue as well as in French. He patronized poets and musicians, and his court became a centre of cultural life. The ideals of chivalry that he had absorbed in childhood now became the guiding principles of his life. He strove to be the perfect knight, brave in battle, generous to his followers, and courteous to all. But Richard's position in Aquitaine also brought him into conflict with his father. Henry II was not willing to give his sons real power. He wanted to keep control of the empire in his own hands. Richard chafed under these restrictions, wanting to rule his duchy without interference. The tensions between father and son would eventually explode into open rebellion, but for now they simmered beneath the surface, adding to the already complicated dynamics of the Angevin family. As Richard grew to manhood, he developed the qualities that would make him famous. He was tall and handsome, with a commanding presence that drew all eyes when he entered a room. He was brave to the point of recklessness, always leading his men from the front and sharing their dangers. He was generous with his followers, rewarding loyalty with land and treasure. He was also proud, quick to take offence, and capable of great cruelty when he felt he had been wronged. These qualities would shape his reign and determine his place in history. The childhood and youth of Richard the Lionheart were a preparation for the great deeds that lay ahead. He was trained from birth to be a warrior and a ruler, and he excelled at both. He absorbed the values of his age, the ideals of chivalry and crusade that motivated the nobility of medieval Europe. He also inherited the conflicts and tensions of his family, the rivalries with his brothers, and the troubled relationship with his father. All of these elements would come together in the years to come as Richard fought his way to the throne of England and then embarked on the great adventure of the Third Crusade. The boy who was born in Oxford in 1157 would grow into one of the most celebrated warriors of the medieval age. His name would become synonymous with courage and martial prowess. Songs would be sung about his deeds, and stories would be told about his adventures for centuries after his death. But all of that lay in the future. For now, Richard was simply a young prince, learning his craft and preparing for the challenges that awaited him. The making of the Lionheart had begun. In 768, when Richard was just 11 years old, his mother Eleanor formally invested him as the Duke of Aquitaine. It was a symbolic ceremony, for Richard was still too young to rule in his own right, but it marked him out as the heir to this great territory and began his long association with the land that would always be closest to his heart. Aquitaine was not just an inheritance for Richard, it was his identity, the place where he felt most at home and where he would spend much of his life. Aquitaine in the 12th century was a land of remarkable diversity and beauty. It stretched from the Loire River in the north to the Pyrenees Mountains in the south, encompassing a vast territory that included some of the richest agricultural land in Europe. The region was famous for its wine, which was exported throughout the known world. It was famous for its sunshine, so different from the grey skies of England and Normandy, and it was famous for its culture, for the troubadours who composed songs of love and honour that would influence European literature for centuries. The capital of Aquitaine was Poitiers, an ancient city that had been important since Roman times. The ducal palace at Poitiers was one of the finest in Europe, and Eleanor had made it a centre of culture and refinement. Here the troubadours gathered to perform their songs, and here the ideals of courtly love were developed and celebrated. Richard grew up in this atmosphere of poetry and romance, and it shaped his character in profound ways. But Aquitaine was not merely a land of poetry and pleasure. It was also a land of fierce independence and constant conflict. The great nobles of the region were proud and quarrelsome, always ready to challenge ducal authority when they saw an opportunity. Ruled from mighty castles perched on hilltops and river crossings, and they commanded the loyalty of hundreds of knights and men-at-arms. Bringing these powerful lords to heel was a challenge that had defeated many rulers before Richard, and it would test him to his limits. The geography of Aquitaine made it difficult to govern. The territory was vast, stretching hundreds of miles from north to south. Communications were slow, and news could take days or even weeks to travel from one end of the duchy to the other. The roads were often poor, especially in the mountainous regions of the south. Rivers provided easier transportation, but they could also serve as barriers, dividing the land into separate regions that developed their own identities and loyalties. Among the most troublesome of Richard's vassals were the lords of the Limousin, a rugged region in the centre of Aquitaine. The Limousin was a land of forests and hills, dotted with castles that seemed to grow out of the rocky landscape. The lords of this region had a long tradition of independence, and they resented any attempt to impose outside authority. They would rebel against Richard again and again throughout his time as Duke, and he would spend countless hours besieging their castles and hunting them through their forests. Another source of trouble was the county of Angoulême, which lay along the important road connecting Poitiers with Bordeaux. The counts of Angoulême were ambitious men who dreamed of expanding their power at the expense of their neighbours. They were skilled at playing different factions against each other, and they were always looking for opportunities to advance their interests. Richard would have to deal with them throughout his career, sometimes as enemies and sometimes as uneasy allies. South lay the county of Toulouse, a rich and powerful territory that the Dukes of Aquitaine had long claimed as their own. Eleanor's family had pursued this claim for generations, but they had never been able to make it stick. The Counts of Toulouse were supported by the kings of France, who saw them as a useful counterweight to Angevin power in the south. Richard would inherit this dispute along with his duchy, and it would draw him into conflicts that stretched across decades. The young Duke faced his first serious military challenge in 1173, when he was just 15 years old. A coalition of rebellious nobles rose against him, seeking to throw off ducal authority and establish their independence. Richard responded with a ferocity that surprised everyone. He gathered his loyal vassals, raised an army, and marched against the rebels with a speed and determination that caught them off guard. One by one he reduced their castles, either by assault or by siege. Those who resisted too long received no mercy. Those who submitted quickly were treated with relative leniency. This early campaign established patterns that would characterize Richard's military career. He was aggressive, always preferring to attack rather than defend. He was fast, moving his forces with a speed that his enemies found difficult to match. He was skilled at siege warfare, understanding how to reduce even the strongest fortifications. And he was ruthless, willing to use terror as a weapon when he believed it would serve his purposes. These qualities made him one of the most feared military commanders of his age. Richard's success in putting down the rebellion impressed his father, but it also worried him. Henry II wanted obedient sons who would follow his lead, not independent warriors who might one day challenge his authority. He began to keep a closer eye on his third son, and tensions between them started to build. Richard wanted real power. Henry wanted to maintain control. This fundamental conflict would poison their relationship for years to come. The young Duke also had to contend with the complex politics of the French court. The King of France, Louis VII, was the nominal overlord of Aquitaine, even though the duchy was held by the Angevin family. Louis was a pious and cautious man, very different from the bold and aggressive Angevin. He had once been married to Eleanor herself, before their marriage was annulled and she wed Henry. Louis never forgot this humiliation, and he spent his reign trying to weaken the Angevin Empire and recover the territories he had lost. Louis died in 1180 and was succeeded by his son Philip, who would become known as Philip Augustus. Philip was only 15 when he became king, but he was already showing signs of the cunning and determination that would make him one of the greatest rulers in French history. Unlike his father, Philip was willing to use any means necessary to achieve his goals. He would lie, cheat, and manipulate without hesitation. He would make alliances and break them as it suited his interests. And he would prove to be Richard's most persistent and dangerous enemy. The relationship between Richard and Philip was complicated from the beginning. They were rivals by birth and circumstance, the heirs to two great dynasties that had been competing for power for generations. But they were also drawn to each other in ways that contemporaries found difficult to understand. They spent time together, shared meals, and even, according to some accounts, shared a bed. The nature of their relationship has been debated by historians ever since, but whatever its exact character, it was intense and significant. Scholars have suggested that Richard and Philip were lovers, pointing to the intimate language used by chroniclers to describe their relationship. Others argue that such closeness was common among medieval nobles and did not necessarily imply a sexual relationship. The truth is probably impossible to determine at this distance in time. What is clear is that Richard and Philip developed a bond that transcended simple friendship, even as their political interests pushed them toward conflict. Richard's time in Aquitaine also saw him develop his skills as a patron of the arts. He gathered poets and musicians at his court, rewarding them generously for their work. He composed songs himself, demonstrating a genuine talent for poetry. His verses dealt with themes of love, honour, and the hardships of war. They showed a sensitive and reflective side that contrasted with his reputation as a fierce warrior. Richard was a complex man, capable of both great violence and great beauty. The troubadour tradition that flourished in Aquitaine had a profound influence on Richard's worldview. The troubadours celebrated an ideal of love that was refined and spiritual, very different from the crude realities of medieval marriage. They sang of knights who performed great deeds to win the favour of noble ladies, of lovers who remained faithful even when separated by vast distances, of honour that transcended mere self-interest. These ideals shaped Richard's understanding of what it meant to be a knight and a ruler. Chivalry, as this code of behaviour came to be known, emphasised several key virtues. Courage was paramount, for a knight was expected to face danger without flinching. Loyalty was essential, for a knight must keep faith with his lord and his companions. Generosity was required, for a knight must share his wealth with those who served him. Mercy was demanded, for a knight must treat others, especially women and the weak, with respect and kindness. Richard strove to embody these virtues throughout his life, though he did not always succeed. The young Duke also showed an interest in military technology and fortification. He studied the castles of Aquitaine, learning how they were built and how they could be taken. He experimented with new techniques of siege warfare, including the use of mining to undermine castle walls and the construction of siege towers to overtop them. He paid close attention to the design of crossbows and other missile weapons, understanding their importance on the battlefield. This technical knowledge would serve him well in the years to come. Richard's administration of Aquitaine was generally effective, if sometimes harsh. He understood that a ruler must be both feared and respected, and he worked to cultivate both qualities. He dispensed justice firmly, punishing those who broke the peace and rewarding those who kept it. He maintained the roads and bridges that facilitated trade, understanding that a prosperous duchy was easier to govern than an impoverished one. He kept a close eye on his officials, making sure they did not abuse their positions for personal gain. But Richard could also be cruel and vindictive. When he felt he had been wronged, he was capable of terrible vengeance. Rebels who defied him too long could expect no mercy. Prisoners were sometimes mutilated or executed to send a message to others who might be thinking of resistance. Richard lived in a violent age, and he was a product of that age. The standards of behaviour that we take for granted today simply did not exist in the 12th century, and Richard's conduct, while sometimes shocking to modern sensibilities, was not unusual for a ruler of his time. In Aquitaine transformed Richard from a boy into a man. He arrived as a child, dependent on his mother and her advisers. He emerged as a formidable warrior and capable administrator, ready to take his place among the great princes of Europe. The challenges he faced in governing this difficult territory prepared him for the even greater challenges that lay ahead. Aquitaine was his training ground, and he learned his lessons well. Throughout this period, Richard maintained a close relationship with his mother Eleanor. She was his advisor, his supporter, and his advocate at the Angevin court. When conflicts arose between Richard and his father, Eleanor usually took her son's side. This alliance between mother and son would have profound consequences for the entire family, contributing to the great rebellion that would soon tear the Angevin Empire apart. Eleanor's influence on Richard extended beyond politics. She shaped his cultural tastes, his appreciation for poetry and music, his understanding of courtly behaviour. She taught him to value learning and refinement, as well as martial prowess. She showed him that a great ruler must be more than just a warrior. He must also be a patron of the arts and a guardian of civilization. Richard absorbed these lessons and carried them with him throughout his life. As the 70s progressed, tensions within the Angevin family continued to build. Henry II was aging, but he showed no signs of wanting to share power with his sons. He kept them dependent on him, granting them titles but not the resources to exercise real authority. He played them against each other, using their rivalries to maintain his own dominance. It was a dangerous game, and it was about to blow up in his face. Richard watched these family dynamics with growing frustration. He had proven himself as a ruler and a warrior, but his father still treated him like a child. He wanted independence, the freedom to govern Aquitaine without interference from England. He wanted recognition of his achievements and respect for his abilities. Instead, he received only suspicion and control. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would change everything. The young Duke of Aquitaine had come far since his investiture as a child. He had learned to fight and to govern, to inspire loyalty and to crush resistance. He had developed his own identity, separate from his father and his brothers, rooted in the sunny lands of the south. He had become, in short, a force to be reckoned with. But his greatest trials were still ahead, and they would test him in ways he could not yet imagine. The year 1173 marked a turning point in the history of the Angevin family. In that year, the simmering tensions between Henry II and his sons finally boiled over into open warfare. What followed was one of the most dramatic family conflicts of the medieval age. A rebellion that pitted father against sons and threatened to tear apart the greatest empire in Western Europe. Richard, though still a teenager, would play a central role in this drama, and the experience would shape him for the rest of his life. The roots of the rebellion lay in Henry's refusal to share real power with his sons. He had given them titles and designated them as heirs to various parts of his empire, but he kept actual authority firmly in his own hands. His eldest surviving son, Henry the young king, had been crowned as co-ruler of England, but he had no lands, no revenues, and no real power. He was a king in name only, dependent on his father for everything. This situation was humiliating for a proud young man, and it bred deep resentment. Richard faced a similar situation in Aquitaine. Although he was duke, his father continued to interfere in the affairs of the duchy, overruling his decisions and undermining his authority. Richard had proven himself capable of governing, but Henry would not let him do so independently. The young duke felt trapped, unable to exercise the power that was rightfully his, forced to defer to a father who seemed determined to keep him subordinate forever. Geoffrey, the third brother, had been betrothed to Constance, the heiress of Brittany, but he too lacked real authority, and John, the youngest, had no designated inheritance at all, which is why he was called Lackland. The brothers shared a common grievance against their father, and this grievance would drive them to take up arms against him. The catalyst for the rebellion was a dispute over castles. Henry II had promised certain castles to his son Henry as part of his inheritance, but he refused to actually hand them over. When the young king demanded what had been promised, his father refused. This was the final straw. The young king fled to the court of King Louis of France, and his brothers soon followed. Eleanor of Aquitaine, long estranged from her husband, encouraged her sons in their rebellion, and may have been the driving force behind it. Louis of France was delighted to receive the rebellious princes. Here was an opportunity to weaken his great rival, to break up the Angevin Empire from within. He recognised the young king as the rightful ruler of England and promised to support him with money and troops. The counts of Flanders, Boulogne and Champagne joined the coalition, as did the King of Scotland and many English barons who had grievances against Henry. It seemed that the old king was surrounded by enemies on all sides. Richard's role in the rebellion was to raise Aquitaine against his father. He was just 15 years old, but he threw himself into the task with characteristic energy. He rallied the nobles of the duchy, many of whom were happy for an excuse to rebel against Angevin authority. He gathered an army and prepared to march against his father's forces. For the first time, Richard would face his father not as a son but as an enemy. The war that followed was fought across the length and breadth of the Angevin Empire. In England, the King of Scotland invaded from the north, while rebellious barons rose in the Midlands and the east. In Normandy, French forces crossed the border and laid siege to important castles. In Aquitaine, Richard and his allies attacked the strongholds that remained loyal to Henry. It was a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm the old king and force him to surrender. But Henry II was not so easily defeated. Despite being surrounded by enemies, he responded with the energy and determination that had made him one of the greatest rulers of his age. He moved with astonishing speed, appearing first in one place and then in another, putting out fires before they could spread. He hired mercenaries to supplement his loyal forces, paying them with the wealth he had accumulated over decades of careful administration. He exploited divisions among his enemies, offering generous terms to those who would abandon the rebellion. The turning point came in July 1174, when Henry crossed from Normandy to England to deal with the threat there. He landed at Southampton and immediately marched north to confront the Scottish invasion. On his way, he stopped at Canterbury to do penance at the tomb of Thomas Becket, the archbishop whose murder had stained his reign. Henry walked barefoot through the streets of Canterbury and submitted to being scourged by the monks of the cathedral. It was a dramatic gesture of humility and repentance, designed to win back the favour of God and the Church. The very next day, news arrived that changed everything. The King of Scotland had been captured by a group of Henry's loyal knights at Alnwick in Northumberland. It seemed like a miracle, a sign that God had forgiven Henry and was now fighting on his side. The capture of the Scottish king broke the back of the rebellion in England. The rebellious barons, seeing that the tide had turned, hastened to make their peace with the king. With England secured, Henry turned his attention to the continent. He crossed back to Normandy and began systematically reducing the rebel strongholds. One by one, his enemies submitted. The young king, seeing that the cause was lost, came to his father and begged for forgiveness. Geoffrey followed suit. Finally, Richard too was forced to acknowledge defeat. He came before his father, threw himself at his feet, and asked for mercy. Henry was surprisingly lenient with his rebellious sons. He understood that he needed them to govern his vast empire, and he could not afford to alienate them permanently. He forgave them and restored them to their positions, though he kept an even tighter grip on power than before. Eleanor, however, was not forgiven. Henry blamed her for instigating the rebellion, and he imprisoned her in various castles for the next 15 years. She would not regain her freedom until after her husband's death. The failed rebellion of 1173 to 1174 had profound consequences for Richard. He had learned that his father was a formidable opponent, not easily defeated even when surrounded by enemies. He had gained valuable military experience, leading armies and besieging castles. He had also learned the importance of timing and patience. The rebellion had failed because it was poorly coordinated and because Henry had moved faster than his enemies expected. Richard would remember these lessons. The years following the rebellion were tense ones for the Angevin family. Henry kept his sons on a short leash, watching them carefully for any signs of renewed disloyalty. Richard returned to Aquitaine, where he faced the task of reasserting his authority over vassals who had joined him in rebellion, and now wondered if they would be punished. He had to walk a fine line, maintaining his father's trust while also keeping the loyalty of his own followers. Richard threw himself into the work of governing Aquitaine with renewed energy. He launched campaigns against rebellious nobles, reducing their castles and forcing them to submit to ducal authority. He was particularly active in the Limousin and the Périgord, regions where resistance to his rule was strongest. His methods were often brutal. He destroyed castles, burned villages, and executed prisoners. He earned a reputation for ferocity that made even hardened warriors think twice before defying him. One of Richard's most notable campaigns during this period was against the fortress of Taillebourg, a seemingly impregnable stronghold that controlled an important crossing of the Charente River. The castle had defied previous attempts to take it, and its lord was one of the most troublesome of Richard's vassals. Richard laid siege to the fortress and eventually took it by storm, a feat that enhanced his already formidable military reputation. The fall of Taillebourg sent a message to all of Aquitaine. Resistance to the Duke was futile. Richard also had to deal with threats from outside his duchy. The Count of Toulouse continued to press his claims to territories that Richard considered his own. The King of France, though officially at peace with the Angevins, was always looking for opportunities to make trouble. And Richard's own brothers were potential rivals, each with their own ambitions and grievances. Navigating these complex relationships required diplomatic skill as well as military prowess. The relationship between Richard and his father remained difficult throughout the late 1170s and early 1180s. Henry continued to interfere in Aquitaine, sometimes overruling Richard's decisions and undermining his authority. Richard resented this treatment, feeling that he had earned the right to govern independently. But he had learned from the failure of the 1173 rebellion, and he was not ready to challenge his father again. Instead, he bided his time, building his strength and waiting for an opportunity. During this period, Richard also began to develop his reputation as a crusader. The Holy Land was never far from the minds of medieval Christians, and the news from the east was increasingly alarming. The Muslim leader Saladin was uniting the various Islamic powers of the region under his command, and the crusader states were under growing pressure. Richard, like many young nobles of his generation, dreamed of going on crusade, of winning glory and salvation by fighting for the faith in the land where Christ had walked. But for now, crusade remained a distant dream. Richard had responsibilities in Aquitaine that he could not abandon, and his father would never have permitted him to leave. The young duke had to content himself with fighting closer to home against the rebellious lords of his own duchy and the enemies who threatened its borders. These campaigns, while less glamorous than crusade, provided valuable experience that would serve Richard well when he finally did go east. The late 1170s also saw Richard reach full adulthood. He was now a man in his 20s, tall and powerful, with the reddish-gold hair and commanding presence that marked him as an Angevin. He had proven himself as a warrior and a ruler. He had survived the failure of the Great Rebellion and had rebuilt his position in Aquitaine. He was ready for whatever challenges the future might bring. But the Angevin family remained dysfunctional, torn by rivalries and resentments that would not heal. Henry II grew older, but showed no signs of wanting to retire or share power. The young king chafed under his father's continued dominance, and his frustration would soon lead to another round of conflict. Geoffrey schemed and plotted, always looking for ways to advance his own interests. And John, the youngest, was emerging as a player in the family drama, his ambitions fed by his father's obvious favouritism. The stage was being set for the final act of the Angevin tragedy. The Great Rebellion of 1173 had failed, but it had not resolved the fundamental conflicts within the family. Those conflicts would continue to fester, growing more bitter with each passing year, until they finally erupted in a new round of warfare that would destroy the old king and clear the way for Richard to claim his inheritance. The road to the throne was long and bloody, but Richard was prepared to walk it. The 1180s were a decade of transformation for Richard and for the Angevin family. During these years, the old order would crumble and a new generation would rise to take its place. Richard would lose brothers and gain enemies. He would come within reach of the throne and then see it slip away. And finally, through a combination of persistence, luck, and his father's death, he would achieve the kingship that had seemed so distant in his youth. The decade began with the death of King Louis VII of France in 1180. Louis had been a cautious and pious ruler, more interested in the welfare of his soul than in the expansion of his kingdom. His son Philip, who now became King Philip II, was a very different man. Philip was ambitious, ruthless, and cunning. He had none of his father's scruples and all of his grandfather's determination to make France the greatest power in Europe. Under Philip's leadership, the French monarchy would become a far more dangerous adversary for the Angevins. Philip was only 15 when he became king, but he immediately began to assert himself. He understood that the key to French power lay in breaking up the Angevin Empire, and he pursued this goal with single-minded determination. He cultivated relationships with Henry's sons, playing on their grievances against their father. He offered them support and encouragement, hoping to use them as tools to weaken Angevin power. Richard, in particular, became close to Philip during this period, a relationship that would have profound consequences. The friendship between Richard and Philip puzzled contemporaries and has fascinated historians ever since. They were natural rivals, the heirs to two competing dynasties. Yet they were drawn to each other, spending time together, sharing confidences, and even, according to some accounts, sharing a bed. The chronicler Roger of Howden wrote that they ate from the same dish and slept in the same bed at night, a description that has led some scholars to suggest a romantic relationship. Others argue that such intimacy was common among medieval nobles and did not necessarily imply anything sexual. Whatever the nature of their relationship, it served Philip's political purposes. By cultivating Richard, he hoped to drive a wedge between the Angevin prince and his father. He encouraged Richard's grievances, sympathising with his complaints about Henry's refusal to share power. He suggested that Richard's position as heir was not secure, that Henry might be planning to disinherit him in favour of John. These suggestions fell on fertile ground, for Richard was already suspicious of his father's intentions. The early 1180s also saw renewed conflict within the Angevin family. The young king, still frustrated by his lack of real power, began to plot against his father once again. This time, he focused his resentment on Richard, demanding that his younger brother do homage to him for Aquitaine. Richard refused, arguing that he held Aquitaine from his mother, not from his brother. The dispute escalated into open warfare, with the young king invading Aquitaine and ravaging the countryside. Henry II initially tried to mediate between his sons, but his efforts were unsuccessful. The young king was determined to humble Richard, and Richard was equally determined to resist. The war dragged on through 1183, causing widespread destruction in Aquitaine. Towns were burned, crops were destroyed, and ordinary people suffered terribly. It was a bitter conflict, made worse by the fact that it was fought between brothers. The war came to an abrupt end in June 1183, when the young king fell ill with dysentery while besieging a castle in the Limousin. He died on June 11th at the age of 28, having never achieved the independent power he so desperately craved. His death transformed the political landscape of the Angevin Empire. Richard was now the eldest surviving son and the obvious heir to all of his father's domains. But Henry II was not ready to acknowledge Richard as his heir. The old king had always favoured his youngest son John, and he now began to scheme to provide for John at Richard's expense. He demanded that Richard surrender Aquitaine to John, a demand that Richard flatly refused. Aquitaine was his by right, the inheritance from his mother that he had spent years defending. He would not give it up, not even to his own brother. The conflict over Aquitaine poisoned the relationship between Richard and his father for the rest of Henry's life. Richard suspected, with good reason, that his father was planning to disinherit him entirely and make John the heir to the whole empire. Henry's actions did nothing to dispel these suspicions. He kept Richard at arm's length, refusing to formally recognise him as heir and continuing to favour John at every opportunity. In 1186 another brother died. Geoffrey, Duke of Brittany, was killed in a tournament accident in Paris. He was trampled by horses during a melee, a violent form of mock combat that was popular among the nobility. Geoffrey's death left only Richard and John among Henry's sons, intensifying the rivalry between them. It also left Geoffrey's widow, Constance, pregnant with a child who would be born after his father's death and named Arthur. This child would later become a rival to John for the throne. The death of Geoffrey brought Richard and Philip even closer together. Philip had been Geoffrey's friend and patron, and he used the occasion of Geoffrey's death to strengthen his ties with Richard. The two men spent more time together, and their alliance became increasingly open. Philip encouraged Richard to demand recognition as his father's heir, promising to support him if Henry refused. Meanwhile, events in the Holy Land were reaching a crisis. In 1187, the Muslim leader Saladin inflicted a catastrophic defeat on the Crusader army at the Battle of Hattin. The flower of Crusader knighthood was destroyed in a single afternoon, and the kingdom of Jerusalem lay open to conquest. Saladin moved quickly, capturing city after city. In October 1187, Jerusalem itself fell to the Muslims, ending nearly 90 years of Christian rule. The news sent shockwaves throughout Europe. The fall of Jerusalem transformed the political situation in the West. Pope Gregory VIII called for a new crusade to reclaim the Holy City, and the call was answered by the greatest rulers of Europe. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa took the cross, as did King Philip of France and, eventually, King Henry of England. Richard had already taken the cross even before his father, burning with zeal to fight for the faith in the land where Christ had died. But the crusade would have to wait. First, Richard had to secure his position at home. The conflict with his father was reaching a climax, and Richard could not leave for the east until it was resolved. In 1188 he took a dramatic step. He went to the French courts and did homage to Philip for all of his continental possessions. This was a direct challenge to his father, an assertion of independence that Henry could not ignore. Henry was furious, but he was also weakening. Years of stress and conflict had taken their toll on the old king. He was suffering from a painful illness, possibly an ulcer or an abscess, that made it difficult for him to ride or fight. His once legendary energy was fading, and his enemies were closing in. Philip and Richard joined forces and invaded Henry's territories, determined to force him to acknowledge Richard as his heir. The War of 1189 was brief but decisive. Henry's vassals, seeing which way the wind was blowing, began to desert him. Castle after castle fell to the Allies. Henry retreated before them, too sick to fight effectively, watching his empire crumble around him. Finally, in July 1189, he was forced to accept a humiliating peace. He agreed to recognise Richard as his heir, to pay an indemnity to Philip, and to submit to various other demands. The final blow came when Henry was shown a list of those who had conspired against him. At the top of the list was the name of his youngest and favourite son, John, the son he had loved and favoured above all others, the son for whom he had schemed to disinherit Richard, had betrayed him in the end. According to the chroniclers, Henry turned his face to the wall and said, "Now let all things go as they will. I care no more for myself or for the world." 2 days later, on July 6, 1189, Henry II died at his castle of Chinon. He was 56 years old and had ruled for 35 years. His last words were reportedly a curse on his sons. "Shame, shame on a conquered king." His body was carried to the Abbey of Fontevraud, where it was buried before the high altar. Richard came to view his father's corpse, and according to one account, blood flowed from the dead king's nose as Richard approached, a sign that the son was responsible for the father's death. Richard was now King of England, Duke of Normandy, Duke of Aquitaine, and Count of Anjou. He had achieved everything he had fought for, but at a terrible cost. His father was dead, his family was shattered, and his conscience was burdened with the knowledge of his own role in the old king's downfall. But there was no time for grief or reflection. Richard had a crusade to organise and a kingdom to secure. The Lionheart was about to enter the most famous chapter of his life. Organising a crusade was an enormous undertaking. Richard needed ships to transport his army across the Mediterranean. He needed money to pay his soldiers and buy supplies. He needed to secure his kingdom against threats while he was away. He needed to coordinate with the other crusading monarchs, particularly Philip of France, who was also preparing to go east. All of this had to be accomplished as quickly as possible, for every day that passed was a day when Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. Richard approached the task with characteristic energy and determination. He raised money by every means available, selling offices, titles, and privileges to anyone who could pay. He famously joked that he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer. He extracted huge sums from his subjects through taxation, pushing the limits of what the kingdom could bear. He sold the right to be released from crusading vows to those who had taken the cross, but now wished to stay home. Every penny went toward the great expedition. The king also worked to secure his kingdom before his departure. He appointed trusted officials to govern in his absence, including his mother Eleanor, whom he had released from imprisonment immediately after his father's death. Eleanor, now in her late 60s but still vigorous and capable, would serve as one of the regents during Richard's absence. Her experience and political skill would prove invaluable in the years to come. Richard also had to deal with his brother John. The relationship between the brothers was complicated. John had betrayed their father at the end, but he was still Richard's heir, at least until Richard had children of his own. Richard tried to buy John's loyalty by giving him vast estates in England and arranging a wealthy marriage for him. But he also took precautions, making John swear not to enter England for 3 years while Richard was on crusade. Richard did not trust his brother, and events would prove that his suspicions were justified. The fleet that Richard assembled was one of the largest ever seen in medieval Europe. Over 100 ships were gathered at various ports along the English and French coasts. These included warships designed for combat, transport vessels for carrying men and horses, and supply ships loaded with food, weapons, and equipment. The logistics of moving such a force across thousands of miles of sea and land were staggering, but Richard was determined to succeed. The army that Richard gathered was equally impressive. Knights came from all over his domains, eager to win glory and salvation in the Holy Land. Men-at-arms, archers, and infantry swelled the ranks. Specialists in siege warfare brought their expertise, for everyone knew that the campaign would involve assaulting the great fortresses that the Muslims had captured. Richard personally supervised the preparations, inspecting ships, reviewing troops, and making sure that everything was ready. Richard also had to coordinate with his fellow crusaders. King Philip of France was also preparing his own expedition, and the two monarchs agreed to travel together and share whatever conquests they might make. This agreement reflected the idealistic spirit of the crusade, the belief that Christian rulers should set aside their differences and unite against the common enemy. But it also reflected the reality that neither king fully trusted the other. By travelling together, each could keep an eye on his rival. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa had already departed for the Holy Land, leading a massive German army overland through the Balkans and Asia Minor. Frederick was one of the most experienced and respected rulers in Europe, a veteran of the Second Crusade who had spent decades building German power. His participation in the Third Crusade gave the expedition enormous prestige and raised hopes that Jerusalem might soon be reclaimed. But tragedy struck the German expedition in June 1190. While crossing a river in Asia Minor, the elderly emperor drowned. The exact circumstances of his death remain unclear. Some accounts say he was swept away by the current while trying to swim across. Others say he suffered a heart attack from the shock of the cold water. Whatever the cause, his death was a catastrophe for the crusade. Without their leader, the German army fell apart. Most of the soldiers turned back, and only a small remnant continued on to the Holy Land. News of Frederick's death reached Richard and Philip as they were preparing to depart. It was a sobering reminder of the dangers that lay ahead, but it did not deter them from their purpose. If anything, it made their participation even more important. With the German crusade in ruins, the burden of reclaiming Jerusalem now fell primarily on the shoulders of the English and French kings. Richard and Philip set out from Vézelay in July 1190, their armies marching together in a great column that stretched for miles along the dusty roads of France. The sight must have been extraordinary. Thousands of armed men moving toward the Mediterranean, their banners flying and their armour glinting in the summer sun. Crowds gathered to watch them pass, and priests blessed them as they went. It was a moment of high drama, the beginning of an adventure that would be remembered for centuries. The two kings parted ways at Lyon, agreeing to meet again in Sicily. Philip took the shorter route through the Alps to Genoa, where he would embark on ships provided by the Italian city-state. Richard took a longer route through his own territories, eventually reaching Marseille, where he expected to find his fleet waiting for him. But the fleet had not yet arrived, delayed by storms and contrary winds. Rather than wait, Richard hired local ships and sailed along the coast to Genoa, then continued on to meet Philip in Sicily. The choice of Sicily as a gathering point was strategic. The island lay at the crossroads of the Mediterranean, making it an ideal place to assemble and resupply before the final leg of the journey to the Holy Land. Sicily was also ruled by the Normans, descendants of the same adventurers who had conquered England in 1066. Richard had family connections to the Sicilian royal house, for his sister Joan had been married to King William II of Sicily. But William had died in 1189, leaving no children. The throne had passed to his illegitimate cousin Tancred, a capable but insecure ruler who faced challenges to his authority from all sides. Joan, now a widow, had been poorly treated by Tancred, who had seized her dowry and confined her to a palace. Richard was furious when he learned of his sister's treatment, and he was determined to secure justice for her. Richard arrived in Sicily in September 1190, and trouble began almost immediately. The local population was hostile to the Crusaders, resenting the presence of so many foreign soldiers in their land. Fights broke out between the Crusaders and the Sicilians, and tensions escalated rapidly. Richard, never one to back down from a challenge, responded with force. He attacked and captured the city of Messina, raising his own banners over its walls. The capture of Messina shocked everyone, including Philip of France. Richard had acted without consulting his ally, and Philip was offended by this display of independent action. The incident revealed the tensions that lay beneath the surface of the crusading alliance. Richard and Philip might have agreed to cooperate, but they were still rivals, each jealous of his own honour and suspicious of the other's intentions. Richard's aggression did achieve its immediate purpose. Tancred, alarmed by the English king's military prowess, quickly came to terms. He agreed to release Joan and restore her dowry. He also agreed to pay a large sum of money in compensation for Richard's expenses, and he recognised Richard's nephew Arthur, the son of the late Geoffrey of Brittany, as Richard's heir. This last provision was significant, for it passed over John in the line of succession, a decision that would have profound consequences later. The Crusaders spent the winter of 1190 to 1191 in Sicily, waiting for the sailing season to begin. It was a tense and difficult time. The soldiers grew restless, and discipline was hard to maintain. Conflicts between the English and French contingents were frequent, and Richard and Philip struggled to keep their alliance together. The two kings quarrelled over various matters, including Richard's failure to marry Philip's sister Alice, to whom he had been betrothed for many years. The question of Richard's marriage was a sensitive one. He had been engaged to Alice since childhood, but he had never shown any enthusiasm for the match. Rumours circulated that Alice had been seduced by Richard's father, Henry II, and had even borne him a child. Whether these rumours were true or not, Richard used them as an excuse to break off the engagement. He announced that he would instead marry Berengaria of Navarre, a princess whose kingdom bordered Aquitaine and whose alliance would strengthen Richard's position in the south. Philip was furious at this insult to his sister, but there was little he could do. Richard was too powerful to coerce, and the crusade was too important to abandon over a personal grievance. Philip accepted a financial settlement in compensation for the broken engagement and agreed to let the matter drop. But the incident further poisoned the relationship between the two kings, adding another layer of resentment to their already complicated dealings. Berengaria arrived in Sicily in March 1191, escorted by Richard's mother Eleanor. The old queen had travelled all the way from England to bring her son's bride to him, a remarkable journey for a woman in her late 60s. Eleanor's presence was a reminder of the importance of this marriage, both for Richard personally and for the future of the Angevin dynasty. Richard needed an heir, and Berengaria was expected to provide one. But Richard and Berengaria could not marry in Sicily, for it was the season of Lent, when weddings were forbidden by the church. The marriage would have to wait until they reached the Holy Land. Eleanor returned to England to resume her duties as regent, while Berengaria joined the crusading fleet for the voyage east. It was an unconventional beginning to a marriage that would prove to be unconventional in many ways. The Crusaders finally departed from Sicily in April 1191. Philip sailed first, eager to reach the Holy Land and begin the campaign. Richard followed a few days later, his fleet of over 200 ships carrying thousands of soldiers, horses, and supplies. It was one of the largest naval expeditions of the medieval age, a testament to Richard's organisational abilities and his determination to succeed. But the voyage did not go smoothly. A storm scattered Richard's fleet, driving some ships off course and wrecking others on the rocky shores of Cyprus. Among the ships that were wrecked were those carrying Berengaria and Joan, who found themselves stranded on an island ruled by a hostile tyrant. Cyprus was nominally part of the Byzantine Empire, but it had been seized by a rebel named Isaac Comnenus, who styled himself emperor and ruled the island as an independent despot. Isaac was cruel and unpopular, hated by his own subjects and distrusted by his neighbours. When the shipwrecked crusaders came ashore, Isaac treated them as enemies, seizing their goods and threatening their lives. Richard was not about to tolerate such treatment. When he learned what had happened, he immediately changed course and sailed for Cyprus. He landed his army and attacked Isaac's forces, routing them in a series of quick engagements. Isaac fled into the interior, but Richard pursued him relentlessly, capturing castle after castle until the tyrant had nowhere left to run. Finally, Isaac surrendered, reportedly asking only that he not be put in iron chains. Richard, with characteristic dark humour, agreed and had chains of silver made for his prisoner instead. Richard wasted no time in taking control of his new domains. Within weeks of his father's death, he had crossed to England to be crowned king. The coronation took place at Westminster Abbey on September 3rd, 1189, a grand ceremony that proclaimed Richard's authority to the world. The new king was anointed with holy oil, invested with the symbols of royalty, and acclaimed by the assembled nobles and clergy. At the age of 32, Richard had achieved the throne that had seemed so distant in his rebellious youth. But the coronation was marred by violence. A group of Jews who had come to offer gifts to the new king were attacked by the crowd outside the abbey. The violence spread, and a full-scale massacre erupted in London. Jewish homes were burned, and many Jews were killed. The violence spread to other cities in the following months, with particularly brutal massacres occurring at York, where the entire Jewish community was wiped out. Richard was horrified by these events and issued orders to protect the Jews, but his commands were largely ignored. The massacres were a dark stain on the beginning of his reign. Richard's mind was focused on the crusade. He had taken the cross before his father's death, and he was determined to fulfill his vow. The fall of Jerusalem had shocked all of Christendom, and the call to reclaim the holy city resonated deeply with Richard's sense of honour and duty. He saw the crusade as the great adventure of his life, the opportunity to win eternal glory by fighting for the faith. Everything else was secondary to this goal. The conquest of Cyprus took only a few weeks, but it was a significant achievement. The island was wealthy, producing wine, sugar, and other valuable commodities. It occupied a strategic position in the eastern Mediterranean, making it an ideal base for operations in the Holy Land. Richard would later sell Cyprus to the Knights Templar, and it would eventually become a crusader kingdom that lasted for centuries. The conquest also demonstrated Richard's military abilities, showing that he could adapt to unexpected situations and turn setbacks into opportunities. It was on Cyprus that Richard finally married Berengaria. The wedding took place on May 12, 1191, in the chapel of the fortress of Limassol. It was a modest ceremony, by royal standards, far from the great cathedrals of England or France, but it served its purpose. Richard was now a married man, with a queen who would share his fortunes for the rest of his life. Berengaria was crowned Queen of England immediately after the wedding, the only English queen ever to be crowned outside of England. With Cyprus secured and his marriage accomplished, Richard resumed his voyage to the Holy Land. He arrived at the port of Acre in June 1191, joining the siege that had been ongoing for nearly 2 years. The crusade was about to enter its most intense phase, and Richard was ready to take command. The city of Acre was one of the most important ports in the Holy Land. It sat on a peninsula jutting into the Mediterranean, protected by massive walls and towers that had been strengthened over generations. Before the disaster at Hattin, Acre had been a thriving commercial centre, home to merchants from Venice, Genoa, Pisa, and other Italian city-states. Its harbour was one of the best on the coast, capable of sheltering large fleets and handling enormous volumes of trade. When Saladin conquered the Crusader states in 1187, Acre fell along with most other Christian strongholds. But the Muslims had not held it for long. In 1189, a small Crusader force led by Guy of Lusignan, the former king of Jerusalem, had arrived outside the walls and begun a siege. It was an audacious move, for Guy's army was far too small to take the city by force. But Guy was desperate. He had lost his kingdom at Hattin and needed a dramatic victory to restore his reputation and his power. What followed was one of the longest and most gruelling sieges of the medieval age. The Crusaders established a camp outside Acre's walls and settled in for a prolonged struggle. Saladin brought his army to relieve the city, but he could not break through the Crusader lines. The result was a strange double siege, with the Crusaders besieging Acre while Saladin besieged the Crusaders. For 2 years, the armies faced each other, neither able to achieve a decisive advantage. The siege of Acre was a brutal affair. Disease swept through the Crusader camp, killing thousands. Food was scarce and prices for basic necessities soared to astronomical levels. Men ate their horses, then their dogs, then whatever else they could find. The winter rains turned the camp into a sea of mud, while the summer heat brought flies and pestilence. Yet the Crusaders held on, sustained by their faith and by the hope that reinforcements would eventually arrive. Those reinforcements began to arrive in the spring of 1191. Philip of France reached Acre in April, bringing fresh troops and much-needed supplies. His arrival boosted Crusader morale and intensified the pressure on the city's defenders. But Philip was cautious by nature, and he was reluctant to launch a major assault without Richard's support. The two kings had agreed to share command, and Philip felt bound by that agreement. Richard arrived in June, and his presence transformed the siege. He brought not only soldiers, but also energy, determination, and an aggressive spirit that had been lacking. From the moment he landed, Richard took charge, inspecting the siege lines, consulting with his commanders, and planning the final assault. His reputation preceded him, and both Crusaders and Muslims knew that the stakes had just been raised. Richard also brought something else, a terrible illness. During the voyage from Cyprus, he had contracted a disease that the chroniclers called Arnaldia, possibly a form of scurvy or trench fever. The illness left him weak and feverish, unable to walk or ride. But even from his sick bed, Richard directed operations, having himself carried on a litter to the front lines so he could supervise the attacks. His determination inspired his men and dismayed his enemies. The siege engines that Richard had brought from Sicily were put to work battering Acre's walls. Giant catapults hurled stones at the fortifications, while sappers dug tunnels beneath the foundations. The Crusaders built siege towers, tall wooden structures that could be rolled up to the walls to allow soldiers to fight at the same level as the defenders. Day after day, the bombardment continued, gradually wearing down the city's defences. The defenders of Acre fought back with equal determination. They launched sorties against the crusader lines, trying to destroy the siege engines and disrupt the attacks. They poured Greek fire, a fearsome incendiary weapon, on anyone who approached the walls. They repaired the damage caused by the bombardment as quickly as they could, working through the night to shore up crumbling fortifications. But they were running out of men and supplies, and they knew that help from Saladin was unlikely to arrive in time. Saladin watched the siege from his camp in the hills, above Acre, frustrated by his inability to break through the crusader lines. He launched several attacks, trying to relieve the pressure on the city, but the crusaders held firm. Richard personally led the defence against one of these attacks, rallying his men and driving back the Muslim forces. It was a display of courage that enhanced his already formidable reputation. The relationship between Richard and Philip deteriorated further during the siege. The two kings quarrelled over strategy, over the division of spoils, and over the question of who should be king of Jerusalem. Philip supported Conrad of Montferrat, a capable Italian nobleman who had married the heiress to the throne. Richard supported Guy of Lusignan, the man who had lost the kingdom at Hattin, but who had shown courage and persistence in beginning the siege of Acre. The dispute would have lasting consequences for the politics of the Crusader states. Philip also fell ill during the siege, suffering from a disease that caused his hair and nails to fall out. The illness left him weakened and demoralised, and he became increasingly eager to return home. His heart was never fully in the crusade. He had come more out of obligation than conviction, and he resented being overshadowed by Richard. The seeds of future conflict were being sown, even as the two kings fought side by side. Finally, in July 1191, the defenders of Acre reached the end of their endurance. The walls had been breached in several places, and the garrison was too weak to repel another assault. On July 12th, they agreed to surrender on terms. The city would be handed over to the Crusaders, and the garrison would be spared in exchange for a ransom. Saladin would pay 200,000 gold pieces, release 1,500 Christian prisoners, and return the true cross, the holy relic that had been captured at Hattin. The fall of Acre was a great victory for the crusade. It gave the Christians a major port, a base from which they could launch further operations. It demonstrated that Saladin was not invincible, that his conquests could be reversed, and it provided a tremendous boost to Crusader morale, proving that the sacrifices of the past 2 years had not been in vain. Richard entered Acre in triumph, his banners flying from the city's towers. He took up residence in the royal palace and began organising the next phase of the campaign. His goal was Jerusalem, the holy city that was the ultimate objective of the crusade. But first there were matters to settle, including the question of what to do with the prisoners from the garrison. The surrender terms had specified that Saladin would pay the ransom and release the prisoners within a month. But as the deadline approached, Saladin delayed, haggling over details and making excuses. Richard grew impatient. He was eager to march on Jerusalem, and he could not afford to leave a large garrison to guard thousands of prisoners. When the deadline passed without payment, Richard made a decision that would haunt his reputation for centuries. On August 20th, 1191, Richard ordered the execution of the Muslim prisoners. Nearly 3,000 men were led out of the city and killed in full view of Saladin's army. It was a brutal act, shocking even by the standards of the time. Richard justified it as a military necessity, arguing that he could not march south while burdened with prisoners, and that Saladin's failure to pay the ransom had voided the surrender terms. But many contemporaries, both Christian and Muslim, were horrified by the massacre. The massacre at Acre has been debated by historians ever since. Some argue that Richard had no choice, that the prisoners posed a genuine threat, and that Saladin's delays were a deliberate attempt to hamper the crusade. Others condemn the massacre as a war crime, an act of cruelty that violated the laws of war and the principles of chivalry. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Richard was a man of his time, and his time was violent. The massacre was terrible, but it was not unprecedented, and Richard's contemporaries, while shocked, did not universally condemn him for it. Shortly after the fall of Acre, Philip announced that he was returning to France. He cited his illness and the need to attend to affairs at home, but everyone knew the real reason. He could no longer tolerate being overshadowed by Richard. Philip left behind a portion of his army under the command of the Duke of Burgundy, but his departure was a blow to the crusade. It also freed Philip to pursue his own interests in Europe, interests that would soon bring him into conflict with Richard. Richard was now the undisputed leader of the crusade. The responsibility for reclaiming Jerusalem rested on his shoulders alone. It was a burden he accepted willingly, even eagerly. The Lionheart was about to embark on the campaign that would make him a legend. With Acre secured and Philip departed, Richard turned his attention to the ultimate goal of the crusade, the recapture of Jerusalem. The holy city lay some 80 miles to the south, across terrain that was controlled by Saladin's forces. To reach it, Richard would have to march his army down the coast, then turn inland through the hills of Judea. It would be a dangerous journey, with the enemy shadowing every step and waiting for an opportunity to strike. Richard understood the challenges he faced. His army was large but not unlimited, and every casualty would be difficult to replace. His supply lines stretched back to Acre, vulnerable to attack. The summer heat was brutal, sapping the strength of men and horses, and Saladin, though defeated at Acre, still commanded a formidable army that outnumbered the Crusaders. Richard would need all his skill and determination to succeed. The march south began on August 22nd, 1191, just 2 days after the massacre of the prisoners. Richard organised his army with meticulous care, arranging the troops in a formation designed to protect against attack from any direction. The infantry marched in a column along the coast, with the sea on their right providing protection from that side. The cavalry rode on the left, ready to charge any enemy who approached. Crossbowmen marched on the outer edge of the column, their deadly weapons keeping the Muslim horse archers at a distance. The discipline of the Crusader army was remarkable. Richard had issued strict orders that no one was to break formation, no matter what the provocation. The Muslim tactics relied on drawing the Crusaders into disordered charges that could be surrounded and destroyed. Richard was determined not to fall into this trap. His men marched in tight formation, enduring the constant harassment of enemy skirmishers without responding. The harassment was relentless. Saladin's light cavalry rode alongside the Crusader column, showering them with arrows and javelins. They would dash in close, loose their missiles, and then gallop away before the Crusaders could respond. The crossbowmen on the outer edge of the column bore the brunt of these attacks, but they held their ground, returning fire and keeping the enemy at bay. It was exhausting, demoralising work, but Richard's iron discipline held the army together. The march proceeded slowly, covering only a few miles each day. The heat was oppressive, and the soldiers suffered terribly from thirst. Richard arranged for the fleet to sail alongside the army, providing supplies and a means of evacuating the wounded. Without this naval support, the march would have been impossible. The Crusaders moved from one coastal town to the next, securing each position before moving on to the next. Saladin watched the Crusader advance with growing concern. He had hoped that his harassment would provoke the Christians into a rash attack, but Richard's discipline had frustrated this strategy. Now Saladin faced a choice. He could continue to shadow the Crusaders, hoping for an opportunity, or he could risk a pitched battle. The Muslim leader decided to fight. He chose his ground carefully, selecting a position near the town of Arsuf where the terrain would favour his cavalry. The Battle of Arsuf, fought on September 7, 1191, was one of the great engagements of the crusading era. Saladin committed his full strength, sending wave after wave of cavalry against the Crusader column. The attacks were fierce and sustained, testing the discipline of Richard's army to its limits. The Crusaders endured hours of punishment, their crossbowmen falling one by one as the Muslim arrows found their marks. Richard held his cavalry in reserve, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He knew that a premature charge would be disastrous, that the Muslim horse archers would simply scatter and then return to overwhelm the disordered Crusaders. But his knights were growing restless, their honour demanding that they respond to the enemy's provocations. The tension in the Crusader ranks was almost unbearable. Finally, two knights could stand it no longer. They broke from the formation and charged the enemy, their lances levelled and their war cries echoing across the battlefield. Richard saw what was happening and made an instant decision. Rather than let the charge fail for lack of support, he ordered the entire cavalry to attack. Thousands of armoured knights thundered across the plain, crashing into the Muslim lines with devastating force. The impact was tremendous. The Muslim cavalry, caught off guard by the sudden charge, was thrown into confusion. The Crusader knights carved through their ranks, their heavy lances and swords proving devastating at close quarters. Saladin tried to rally his men, but the momentum was against him. The Muslim army broke and fled, pursued by the exultant Crusaders. The Battle of Arsuf was a significant victory for Richard. He had defeated Saladin in open battle, something few Crusader commanders had ever achieved. He had demonstrated that disciplined infantry and heavy cavalry working together could overcome the Muslim tactical system, and he had opened the road to Jerusalem, removing the last major obstacle between his army and the Holy City. But the victory was not as complete as Richard had hoped. The Muslim army had been defeated but not destroyed. Saladin was able to rally his forces and continue the campaign, and the Crusaders had suffered significant casualties, losses that would be difficult to replace. Richard had won the battle, but the war was far from over. After Arsuf, Richard continued his march south, reaching the port of Jaffa in mid-September. Jaffa had been destroyed by Saladin to prevent its use by the Crusaders, and Richard set his men to work rebuilding its fortifications. The city would serve as the base for the final advance on Jerusalem, and it needed to be secure before the army could move inland. The rebuilding of Jaffa took several weeks, during which Richard also conducted negotiations with Saladin. The two leaders exchanged messages and gifts, each taking the measure of the other. Richard proposed various peace terms, including the division of the Holy Land between Christians and Muslims. Saladin countered with his own proposals. The negotiations were complex and ultimately unsuccessful, but they revealed a mutual respect between the two commanders. One of the most intriguing episodes of the negotiations involved Richard's proposal that his sister Joan should marry Saladin's brother, Al-Adil. The couple would rule Jerusalem jointly, creating a lasting peace between Christians and Muslims. It was a creative solution, but it founded on religious objections. Joan refused to marry a Muslim, and Al-Adil refused to convert to Christianity. The proposal came to nothing, but it showed that Richard was willing to think outside conventional boundaries in pursuit of his goals. By November 1191, Richard was ready to advance on Jerusalem. He led his army inland through the hills of Judea toward the Holy City. The weather had turned cold and rainy, making the march difficult. The roads were muddy and supplies were hard to obtain. The soldiers suffered from the cold and from the constant harassment of Muslim raiders. But they pressed on, driven by the dream of praying at the Holy Sepulchre. The Crusaders advanced to within 12 miles of Jerusalem before Richard called a halt. He had received intelligence that Saladin had reinforced the city's garrison and poisoned the wells along the approach routes. An assault on Jerusalem would be costly, and even if successful, the Crusaders might not be able to hold the city. Richard's army was too small to garrison Jerusalem while also defending the coastal cities. A siege might succeed, but the Crusaders would then be trapped in a city surrounded by enemies, with no secure supply line to the coast. It was an agonizing decision. Richard had come so close to his goal, and his men were desperate to complete the pilgrimage that had brought them so far. But Richard was a realist as well as a romantic. He understood that capturing Jerusalem would be meaningless if they could not hold it. With a heavy heart, he ordered the army to retreat to the coast. The withdrawal from Jerusalem was a crushing blow to Crusader morale. Many soldiers wept as they turned their backs on the holy city. Some blamed Richard for the decision, accusing him of cowardice or treachery, but Richard knew he had made the right choice. He would try again, but first he needed to strengthen his position and secure his supply lines. The winter of 1191 to 1192 was spent in rebuilding and consolidation. Richard fortified the coastal cities, repaired the defences of Jaffa and Ascalon, and tried to maintain the cohesion of his army. It was difficult work. Many crusaders had fulfilled their vows by reaching the Holy Land and were eager to return home. The French contingent left behind by Philip was increasingly unreliable, their commander more interested in pursuing his own agenda than in supporting Richard. The politics of the Crusader states also demanded Richard's attention. The dispute over the kingship of Jerusalem had not been resolved. Guy of Lusignan, Richard's candidate, was unpopular with the local barons, who preferred Conrad of Montferrat. Richard eventually accepted a compromise. Conrad would become king, while Guy would be compensated with the lordship of Cyprus. But before Conrad could be crowned, he was assassinated by members of the Assassins, a secretive Muslim sect known for their targeted killings. Conrad's assassination shocked everyone and raised suspicions about who might have ordered it. Some blamed Richard, noting that he had opposed Conrad's candidacy. Others blamed Saladin, who had reason to want the Crusader leadership destabilized. The truth has never been established, but the assassination removed a capable leader at a critical moment and further complicated the already tangled politics of the crusade. With Conrad dead, the throne of Jerusalem passed to his widow Isabella, who quickly remarried to Henry of Champagne, a nephew of both Richard and Philip. Henry became the new ruler of the Crusader kingdom, a compromise candidate acceptable to most factions. Richard had managed to navigate the political crisis, but it had consumed time and energy that he could ill afford. In the spring of 1192, Richard made another attempt on Jerusalem. He led his army inland once again, advancing even closer to the city than before. The Crusaders came within sight of Jerusalem's walls, close enough to see the golden dome of the Al-Aqsa Mosque glinting in the sunlight. But once again, Richard pulled back. The strategic situation had not changed. Jerusalem could be taken but not held. The second withdrawal was even more demoralizing than the first. Richard's frustration was immense. He had come so far and achieved so much, yet the ultimate prize remained beyond his grasp. He reportedly refused to look at Jerusalem when it came into view, saying that he was not worthy to see what he could not deliver. Whether this story is true or not, it captures the anguish that Richard must have felt at this moment of his career. The summer of 1192 brought a new crisis. Saladin, sensing that the Crusaders were weakening, launched a surprise attack on Jaffa. The city fell quickly, its garrison overwhelmed by the sudden assault. Only the citadel held out, its defenders desperately hoping for relief. Richard was at Acre when he heard the news, and he immediately set out to save the city. What followed was one of the most dramatic episodes of Richard's career. He sailed south with a small force, arriving at Jaffa before his main army. Finding the harbour blocked by Muslim ships, Richard waded ashore at the head of his men, sword in hand, and attacked the enemy forces on the beach. The surprise and ferocity of his assault threw the Muslims into confusion, and Richard was able to fight his way into the city and relieve the citadel. But Richard's force was tiny, no more than a few hundred men against Saladin's thousands. The Muslim leader, learning of Richard's vulnerability, launched a dawn attack designed to overwhelm the Crusaders before reinforcements could arrive. Richard's men formed a defensive line, their shields locked together, their spears bristling outward. The Muslim cavalry charged again and again, but they could not break the Crusader formation. Richard himself fought in the front rank, his sword rising and falling as he cut down anyone who came within reach. Chroniclers describe him as a figure of terrifying power, his armour splashed with blood, his voice roaring commands above the din of battle. At one point, his horse was killed beneath him, and Saladin, in a gesture of chivalric respect, sent him 2 fresh mounts so that the battle could continue on equal terms. The Battle of Jaffa ended in a Crusader victory, one of the most remarkable of the entire crusade. Richard had defeated a force many times his size, through sheer courage and determination. The victory restored Crusader morale and demonstrated once again that Richard was one of the greatest warriors of his age. But it also showed the limits of what courage alone could achieve. Richard had saved Jaffa, but he was no closer to Jerusalem. By now, both sides were exhausted. Richard was ill again, weakened by the diseases that plagued the Crusader army. Saladin was also unwell, his health broken by years of campaigning. Neither leader had the strength to continue the war indefinitely. Negotiations resumed, and this time they made progress. The Treaty of Jaffa, concluded in September 1192, ended the Third Crusade. Under its terms, the Crusaders retained control of the coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, but Christian pilgrims were guaranteed free access to the holy sites. The true cross was not returned, despite earlier promises. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but it was the best that could be achieved under the circumstances. Richard had not recaptured Jerusalem, and by that measure, the Third Crusade was a failure. But he had achieved much else. He had saved the Crusader states from extinction, securing a foothold on the coast that would last for another century. He had defeated Saladin in battle, proving that the great Muslim leader was not invincible, and he had established a reputation as the greatest warrior of his age, a reputation that would endure for centuries. On October 9th, 1192, Richard set sail from Acre, leaving the Holy Land for the last time. He had spent 16 months in the East fighting almost continuously, and he was eager to return home. But the journey back would prove to be almost as eventful as the crusade itself, and new dangers awaited him that he could not have anticipated. Richard's decision to return home was driven by alarming news from Europe. His brother John, ignoring his oath to stay out of England, had returned and was scheming to seize power. King Philip of France, freed from his crusading obligations, had invaded Normandy and was threatening Richard's continental possessions. The Angevin Empire was in danger, and Richard needed to return as quickly as possible to save it. But the journey home would not be easy. Richard had made many enemies during the Crusade, and the routes back to England were fraught with danger. The sea route through the Strait of Gibraltar was long and hazardous, especially in the autumn storms. The land route through France was blocked by Philip, who would certainly arrest Richard if he fell into his hands. The only remaining option was to travel through the lands of the Holy Roman Empire, but even this route was dangerous. Richard had quarrelled with Duke Leopold of Austria during the siege of Acre. The dispute arose over the division of spoils and the treatment of Leopold's banner, which Richard had allegedly thrown into a ditch. Leopold was a proud man, and he had not forgotten the insult. He had returned home from the crusade nursing a grudge against the English king, and he would not hesitate to take revenge if the opportunity arose. Richard was aware of these dangers, and he took precautions. He disguised himself as a pilgrim returning from the Holy Land, hoping to pass through hostile territory unrecognised. He travelled with only a small retinue, avoiding the attention that a large party would attract. But his precautions were not enough. Near Vienna, in December 1192, Richard was recognised and captured by Leopold's men. The circumstances of Richard's capture have become the stuff of legend. According to one popular story, Richard was discovered working as a kitchen servant in an inn. His identity revealed when he was seen wearing a valuable ring that no servant could afford. Another version says that Richard was betrayed by a companion who revealed his hiding place. Whatever the truth, Richard found himself a prisoner, his freedom at the mercy of a man who hated him. Leopold was delighted with his prize, but he faced a dilemma. Capturing a crusader returning from the Holy Land was a serious offence, one that could bring down the wrath of the Church. The Pope had placed all crusaders under his protection, and anyone who harmed them risked excommunication. Leopold needed to find a way to profit from his captive without incurring the full force of papal condemnation. The solution was to transfer Richard to the custody of the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI. Henry was one of the most powerful rulers in Europe, and he had his own reasons to resent Richard. The English king had supported the Norman rulers of Sicily against Henry's claims to that kingdom, and Henry was eager for revenge. By taking custody of Richard, Henry could share the blame for holding a crusader prisoner, while also gaining leverage over one of his most troublesome rivals. The transfer took place in early 1193, and Richard found himself imprisoned in various castles across the empire. He was moved from place to place, never staying long in one location, as Henry sought to keep his whereabouts secret and prevent any rescue attempt. The conditions of Richard's imprisonment were not harsh by medieval standards. He was treated as a royal prisoner, given comfortable quarters, and allowed to receive visitors. But he was still a captive, his freedom dependent on the whims of men who wished him ill. News of Richard's capture spread quickly across Europe. In England, the reaction was one of shock and dismay. The king was a prisoner, held by foreign powers, who demanded an enormous ransom for his release. The kingdom was vulnerable, its ruler unable to defend it against the schemes of his enemies. John saw an opportunity and moved quickly to exploit it. He allied himself with Philip of France, promising to cede Norman territories in exchange for French support. Together, they plotted to keep Richard imprisoned forever. Eleanor of Aquitaine, now in her 70s but still formidable, took charge of the effort to free her son. She rallied the loyal barons of England, organised a collection of the ransom, and worked tirelessly to counter the plots of John and Philip. Her energy and determination during this crisis were remarkable, a testament to her enduring strength and her devotion to Richard. Without Eleanor's efforts, Richard might never have regained his freedom. The ransom demanded for Richard was staggering. Henry VI initially asked for 100,000 marks of silver, an almost unimaginable sum that would have bankrupted most kingdoms. After negotiations, the amount was increased to 150,000 marks, with additional conditions including the provision of hostages and military support for Henry's campaigns. It was the largest ransom ever demanded for a medieval king, a reflection of Richard's importance and of Henry's greed. Raising such a sum required extraordinary measures. Every church in England was required to contribute its silver plate. A special tax was levied on all property, with everyone required to pay a quarter of their annual income. The wool crop, one of England's most valuable exports, was seized and sold. Even the Cistercian monks, who were normally exempt from taxation, were forced to contribute their wool. The burden fell heavily on all classes of society, from the greatest nobles to the poorest peasants. The collection of the ransom took more than a year. Eleanor personally supervised the effort, travelling across England to ensure that every penny was gathered. She faced resistance from some quarters, particularly from John's supporters, who hoped that delays would keep Richard imprisoned. But Eleanor was relentless, using a combination of persuasion and coercion to overcome all obstacles. By the end of 1193, most of the ransom had been collected and was ready for delivery. While the ransom was being raised, Richard was not idle. He used his time in captivity to conduct diplomacy, receiving visitors and sending messages to his supporters. He appeared before the imperial diet at Hagenau, where he defended himself against the charges brought by his enemies. His performance was impressive, combining eloquence with dignity. Even those who had come to condemn him were moved by his defence, and many began to question whether it was right to hold such a man prisoner. Richard also composed poetry during his captivity, including a famous song that lamented his imprisonment and called upon his friends to secure his release. The song, written in both French and Occitan, expressed Richard's frustration and his hope that his loyal subjects would not abandon him. It became one of the most famous poems of the medieval period, a testament to Richard's literary talents as well as his political skills. The legend of Blondel, Richard's faithful minstrel, dates from this period. According to the story, Blondel travelled across Europe searching for his master, singing a song that only Richard would recognise beneath the walls of every castle he passed. When he finally heard Richard's voice, joining in the song from within a tower, Blondel knew he had found the king and was able to report his location to those working for his release. The story is almost certainly fictional, but it captures the romantic image of Richard that developed during and after his lifetime. Philip of France and John were desperate to prevent Richard's release. They offered Henry VI enormous sums to keep Richard imprisoned, reportedly matching the ransom amount if Henry would refuse to let Richard go. Henry was tempted by these offers, and for a time it seemed that Richard might never be freed. But the emperor ultimately decided that the ransom in hand was worth more than promises from unreliable allies. He accepted the ransom and agreed to release Richard. The formal release took place on February 4th, 1194, at Mainz. Richard had been a prisoner for more than a year, held in various castles across the empire. He emerged from captivity with his reputation enhanced rather than diminished. His dignified conduct during his imprisonment, his eloquent defence before the imperial diet, and the loyalty of his subjects in raising the ransom had all contributed to his legend. The Lionheart was free, and he was eager for revenge. Before leaving Germany, Richard performed an act that would have significant consequences. He did homage to Henry VI for the Kingdom of England, acknowledging the emperor as his overlord. This was a humiliating concession, one that theoretically made England a fief of the Holy Roman Empire. In practice, the arrangement meant little, as Henry had no way to enforce his overlordship. But it was a reminder of the price Richard had paid for his freedom. Richard landed in England on March 13, 1194, more than 4 years after he had left for the crusade. He was greeted with joy by his loyal subjects, who had sacrificed so much to secure his release. But there was no time for celebration. John's rebellion had to be crushed, and the territories lost to Philip had to be recovered. Richard threw himself into these tasks with characteristic energy. John's position collapsed almost immediately upon Richard's return. The castles held by John's supporters surrendered, one after another, their garrisons unwilling to resist the rightful king. John himself fled to France, seeking refuge with Philip. Richard was inclined to be merciful, dismissing his brother's rebellion as the foolishness of a child led astray by bad advisers. But he did not forget John's treachery, and the relationship between the brothers would never fully recover. Richard spent only 2 months in England before crossing to Normandy to confront Philip. The French king had taken advantage of Richard's absence to seize significant territories, including important castles along the Norman border. Richard was determined to recover everything that had been lost, and he launched a campaign that would occupy him for the rest of his life. The war with Philip was a complex affair, involving sieges, raids, and diplomatic manoeuvres. Richard proved himself as formidable in this conflict as he had been in the Holy Land, outmanoeuvring Philip at almost every turn. He recaptured most of the lost territories and built new fortifications to secure his gains. The most famous of these was Château Gaillard, a massive castle overlooking the Seine that Richard called his fair daughter, and boasted could be held even if its walls were made of butter. The construction of Château Gaillard was a remarkable achievement. Richard personally supervised the design, incorporating lessons he had learned from the fortifications of the Holy Land. The castle featured multiple lines of defence, with walls that curved to deflect projectiles, and towers positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. It was built with astonishing speed, completed in just 2 years despite its enormous size. Château Gaillard represented the cutting edge of military architecture, and it demonstrated Richard's mastery of the art of fortification. Richard's military reputation continued to grow during this period. He won battle after battle, capturing castles that were thought to be impregnable and defeating armies that outnumbered his own. His personal courage was legendary. He led charges from the front, fought in the thick of combat, and took risks that terrified his advisers. The nickname Lionheart, which he had earned in the Holy Land, was confirmed and enhanced by his exploits in France. But the war was also exhausting. Richard spent money at a prodigious rate, hiring mercenaries, building castles, and maintaining his army in the field. The ransom had drained England's wealth, and the continued demands for money created resentment among his subjects. Richard was forced to impose heavy taxes and to sell offices and privileges to raise funds. His government became increasingly extractive, squeezing every penny it could from the kingdom. Richard's relationship with the church also became strained during this period. He quarrelled with various bishops and abbots over money and appointments. He seized church property to fund his wars and ignored papal attempts to mediate the conflict with Philip. The Pope threatened excommunication, but Richard was not deterred. He believed that his cause was just and that God would ultimately vindicate him. The personal life of Richard during these years remains somewhat mysterious. His marriage to Berengaria had produced no children, and the couple spent most of their time apart. Berengaria lived in various locations on the continent, rarely seeing her husband. The reasons for this estrangement are unclear. Some historians have suggested that Richard was homosexual or bisexual, pointing to his close relationships with other men and his apparent lack of interest in his wife. Others argue that the evidence for this interpretation is thin, and that Richard's behaviour was not unusual for a medieval king constantly occupied with warfare. What is clear is that Richard had no legitimate heir. His nephew Arthur of Brittany, the son of his late brother Geoffrey, was one possible successor. His brother John was another. Richard seems to have wavered between these options, sometimes favouring Arthur and sometimes favouring John. The uncertainty about the succession would have profound consequences after Richard's death. As the 1190s drew to a close, Richard's position was strong, but not secure. He had recovered most of the territories lost during his captivity and had built a formidable defensive system to protect his domains. But Philip was still a threat, always probing for weaknesses and looking for opportunities. The war showed no signs of ending, and Richard knew that he would have to continue fighting for as long as he lived. The cost of the war, both in money and in lives, was enormous. Thousands had died in the fighting, and many more had been impoverished by the taxes needed to fund it. The countryside of Normandy and the surrounding regions had been devastated by repeated campaigns. Churches and monasteries had been plundered, and the normal rhythms of life had been disrupted. It was a heavy price to pay, but Richard believed it was necessary to preserve his inheritance. Richard's health was also a concern. The illnesses he had contracted in the Holy Land had never fully healed, and the stresses of constant warfare took their toll. He was in his early 40s, not old by modern standards, but approaching the end of a normal medieval lifespan. The question of what would happen after his death was becoming increasingly urgent, though Richard seemed reluctant to address it directly. The captivity and its aftermath had changed Richard in some ways. He was perhaps more cautious than before, more aware of his own vulnerability, but his fundamental character remained the same. He was still the bold, aggressive warrior who had won fame in the Holy Land. He was still the proud, hot-tempered king who would not tolerate any challenge to his authority, and he was still the romantic figure who inspired songs and stories across Europe. The Lionheart had survived his captivity, but his greatest trials were not yet over. Richard's return to England in March 1194 was a moment of triumph after the long ordeal of captivity. The king landed at Sandwich and made his way to Canterbury, where he gave thanks at the shrine of Thomas Becket for his safe deliverance. From Canterbury, he travelled to London, where he was received with great celebration. The streets were decorated, and crowds gathered to catch a glimpse of their king. It was a homecoming that Richard had dreamed of during the long months of imprisonment. But Richard had little time to enjoy the celebrations. The kingdom required his attention, and there was much to be done. John's rebellion had shaken the foundations of royal authority, and Richard needed to reassert his control. He held a great council at Nottingham, where he dealt with those who had supported his brother's treachery. Most were pardoned after paying heavy fines, for Richard needed money more than he needed vengeance. Only a few of the most persistent rebels were punished severely. The castle of Nottingham itself had held out for John, its garrison refusing to believe that Richard had really returned. Richard personally led the assault on the castle, demonstrating that he had lost none of his military skills during his captivity. The garrison surrendered after a brief resistance, and Richard took possession of the fortress. It was a symbolic victory, showing that the king was back and that resistance was futile. Richard also held a crown-wearing ceremony at Winchester, reasserting his royal dignity after the humiliations of captivity. The ceremony was a deliberate statement of power, reminding everyone that Richard was still king, still the anointed ruler of England. The great nobles of the realm attended, renewing their oaths of loyalty and acknowledging Richard's authority. Whatever doubts had arisen during his absence were put to rest. The financial situation of the kingdom was dire. The ransom had drained the treasury, and John's rebellion had disrupted the normal collection of revenues. Richard needed money desperately, both to pay his debts and to fund the war against Philip. He appointed Hubert Walter, the Archbishop of Canterbury, as his chief minister, giving him broad powers to reform the administration and increase revenues. Hubert Walter proved to be an excellent choice, reorganising the government and implementing new systems of taxation that would serve the crown for generations. Richard's stay in England was brief. By May 1194, he had crossed to Normandy to confront Philip. He would never return to England, spending the remaining 5 years of his life on the continent, fighting to preserve his inheritance. This has led some historians to criticise Richard as an absentee king who neglected his English realm. But Richard saw things differently. England was secure, protected by the sea, and governed by capable ministers. The real threat was in France, where Philip was actively working to dismember the Angevin Empire. Richard went where he was needed most. The war with Philip was fought across a broad front, from Normandy in the north to Aquitaine in the south. Richard proved himself a master of this kind of warfare, combining strategic vision with tactical brilliance. He understood the importance of castles in medieval warfare, and he devoted enormous resources to building and strengthening fortifications. He also understood the importance of mobility, moving his forces quickly to exploit opportunities and counter threats. One of Richard's most significant achievements during this period was the construction of Château Gaillard, the great fortress that guarded the Seine Valley. Richard chose the site personally, recognizing its strategic importance. The castle was built on a rocky spur overlooking the river, commanding the main route from Paris to Rouen. Its design incorporated the latest advances in military architecture, with concentric walls, rounded towers, and carefully planned fields of fire. The construction of Château Gaillard was a massive undertaking. Thousands of workers laboured on the site, quarrying stone, mixing mortar, and hauling materials up the steep slopes. Richard visited frequently, supervising the work and making adjustments to the design. He spared no expense, determined to create a fortress that would be truly impregnable. The castle was completed in just 2 years, an astonishing achievement that demonstrated both Richard's determination and his organisational abilities. Richard reportedly loved Château Gaillard more than any of his other possessions. He called it his fair daughter and boasted that he could hold it against any enemy. The castle was more than just a military installation. It was a statement of power, a symbol of Richard's determination to hold his territories against all comers. It would remain the key to the defence of Normandy for years after Richard's death. The war with Philip was not just a matter of castles and sieges. There were also pitched battles, raids, and diplomatic manoeuvres. Richard excelled at all of these, consistently outperforming his rival. In 1194, he won a significant victory at Fréteval, capturing Philip's baggage train along with important documents and treasure. The loss was humiliating for Philip, who was forced to flee the field to avoid capture. Richard also proved adept at the diplomatic game. He built alliances with Philip's enemies, including the Counts of Flanders and Boulogne, and various German princes. He exploited divisions within France, supporting rebels against Philip's authority. He even negotiated with the Pope, seeking to use the Church's influence against his rival. Richard understood that warfare was not just about fighting, it was also about politics and diplomacy. The conflict between Richard and Philip was intensely personal. The two men had once been close, sharing meals and even, according to some accounts, a bed. But that intimacy had turned to hatred, and each was determined to destroy the other. Philip was patient and calculating, willing to wait for opportunities and exploit weaknesses. Richard was bold and aggressive, preferring to force the issue through direct action. Their contrasting styles made for a fascinating contest. Philip's strategy was to wear Richard down through attrition. He knew that he could not match Richard in open battle, so he avoided major engagements whenever possible. Instead, he focused on capturing castles, disrupting Richard's supply lines, and encouraging rebellion among Richard's vassals. It was a slow, grinding approach, but it had the potential to succeed if Philip could maintain it long enough. Richard countered with his own strategy of aggressive defence. He built castles to secure key positions, launched raids to keep Philip off balance, and responded quickly to any threat. He was constantly on the move, appearing first in one place and then in another, never giving Philip a chance to concentrate his forces. It was an exhausting pace, but Richard thrived on it. The war also had a naval dimension. Richard understood the importance of controlling the English Channel, which connected England with Normandy and allowed the movement of troops and supplies. He built a fleet of warships and used them to protect his sea lanes and threaten Philip's coastal territories. The naval war was less dramatic than the land campaigns, but it was equally important to the overall strategic situation. Richard's relations with his vassals were complex during this period. Some were loyal, supporting him with men and money. Others were unreliable, always looking for opportunities to advance their own interests. A few were openly hostile, siding with Philip in hopes of gaining territory or independence. Richard had to balance the demands of the war with the need to maintain the loyalty of his followers, a task that required constant attention. The Church also played a role in the conflict. The Pope attempted to mediate between Richard and Philip, calling for truces and peace negotiations. Richard was generally sceptical of these efforts, suspecting that they were designed to benefit Philip, but he could not ignore the Church entirely, and he participated in various negotiations and conferences. None of these efforts produced a lasting peace, but they did provide occasional respites from the fighting. Richard's personal life during these years remains obscure. His wife Berengaria lived apart from him, residing in various locations on the continent. There is no evidence that they ever reconciled, or that Richard made any effort to produce an heir with her. The succession remained uncertain, with Arthur of Brittany and John both potential candidates. Richard seems to have preferred Arthur, but he never formally designated him as heir. The question of Richard's sexuality has fascinated historians for centuries. Some have argued that he was homosexual, pointing to his close relationships with other men and his apparent lack of interest in his wife. The evidence for this interpretation is suggestive, but not conclusive. Medieval chroniclers sometimes used intimate language to describe friendships between men, and the absence of children could have many explanations. What is clear is that Richard did not conform to conventional expectations of marriage and family life. Richard's health was a concern throughout this period. He had never fully recovered from the illnesses he contracted in the Holy Land, and the stresses of constant warfare took their toll. He was wounded several times in battle and suffered from recurring fevers. His physicians urged him to rest, but Richard ignored their advice. He was driven by a sense of urgency, a feeling that time was running out, and that he had to accomplish as much as possible before it was too late. The late 1190s saw a gradual shift in the balance of power. Richard was winning the war, slowly recovering the territories that Philip had seized and building a defensive system that would be difficult to overcome. Philip was growing discouraged, his resources depleted, and his allies falling away. A decisive victory for Richard seemed possible, perhaps even imminent. But fate had other plans. As the year 1199 began, Richard was at the height of his power. He had defeated Philip in battle after battle, recovered most of his lost territories, and built the mightiest fortress in Europe. His reputation as a warrior was unmatched, and his enemies feared him. But Richard was also exhausted, worn down by years of constant warfare. He was 41 years old, and he had been fighting almost continuously since his teenage years. The end, when it came, would be sudden and unexpected. The final chapter of Richard's life began in March 1199 in the Limousin region of central France. A peasant ploughing a field near the castle of Charlus-Chabrol had discovered a treasure, reportedly a hoard of Roman gold that included statues and coins of great value. The local lord, Achard of Charlus, claimed the treasure for himself, but Richard, as Duke of Aquitaine, demanded that it be handed over to him. When Achard refused, Richard marched his army to Charlus to take the treasure by force. The castle of Charlus-Chabrol was a small fortress, nothing like the great strongholds that Richard had besieged in the Holy Land or built in Normandy. Its garrison was tiny, perhaps no more than 40 men, and it had no hope of withstanding a determined assault. Richard expected the siege to be brief, a minor operation that would be concluded in a matter of days. He had no idea that this insignificant castle would be the site of his death. The siege began on March 25th, 1199. Richard's forces surrounded the castle and began the work of reducing its defences. Siege engines were brought up to batter the walls, and sappers began digging tunnels to undermine the foundations. The garrison resisted as best they could, but their situation was hopeless. It was only a matter of time before the castle fell. On the evening of March 26th, Richard rode out to inspect the siege works. He was not wearing his full armour, only a light mail shirt and a helmet. He carried a shield, but he was otherwise unprotected. It was a casual inspection, the kind of thing Richard had done hundreds of times before. He had no reason to expect danger from such a weak garrison. As Richard surveyed the castle walls, a crossbowman on the battlements took aim. The man's name was Pierre Basile, and he was one of the few defenders still willing to resist. He had been shooting at the besiegers all day, using a frying pan as a makeshift shield to protect himself from return fire. When he saw Richard below, he recognised the opportunity and loosed his bolt. The crossbow bolt struck Richard in the left shoulder, near the neck. It was a serious wound, but not necessarily fatal if treated properly. Richard rode back to his tent and summoned his physicians. They attempted to remove the bolt, but the operation was botched. The shaft came out, but the iron head remained embedded in Richard's flesh. The surgeons cut and probed, trying to extract the arrowhead, but they only made things worse. The wound became infected, and gangrene set in. Richard knew he was dying. He had seen enough battlefield injuries to recognise the signs of a mortal wound. He sent for his mother Eleanor, who rushed to his side from Fontevraud. He also sent for the crossbowman who had shot him, wanting to see the man who had brought down the Lionheart. Pierre Basile was brought before the dying king, expecting to be tortured and executed. Richard asked him why he had shot him. Basile replied that Richard had killed his father and 2 brothers, and that he had taken his revenge. He said he was ready to die and would endure whatever torments Richard chose to inflict. Richard's response surprised everyone. He forgave Basile, ordering that he be released unharmed and given a sum of money. It was an act of Christian charity, a final gesture of the chivalric values that Richard had tried to embody throughout his life. Richard said that he was about to meet his Maker and did not want to face judgment with a desire for vengeance in his heart. The forgiveness of Pierre Basile became one of the most famous episodes of Richard's life, a story that was told and retold for centuries. It showed a different side of the Lionheart, a capacity for mercy and forgiveness that contrasted with his reputation for ferocity. Whether Richard's motives were purely spiritual, or whether he also hoped to enhance his posthumous reputation, the gesture was a fitting end to a remarkable life. Richard died on April 6, 1199, 11 days after being wounded. He was 41 years old and had reigned for nearly 10 years. His mother Eleanor was at his bedside, holding his hand as he breathed his last. According to the chroniclers, Richard confessed his sins, received the last rites of the church, and died in a state of grace. The Lionheart was gone. Richard's death was a disaster for the Angevin Empire. He had been the force that held everything together, the warrior king whose reputation kept his enemies at bay. Without him, the empire would quickly unravel. His brother John, who succeeded him, lacked Richard's military abilities and his personal authority. Within a few years, Philip of France would conquer Normandy, Anjou, and most of the other continental territories. The great empire that Henry II had built would be reduced to England and a fragment of Aquitaine. The immediate aftermath of Richard's death was chaotic. His orders to release Pierre Basile were ignored by his captain Mercadier, who had the crossbowman flayed alive and hanged. It was a brutal act that violated Richard's final wishes, but it reflected the savage nature of medieval warfare. Mercadier himself would be murdered a few months later, killed by a rival in a dispute over plunder. Richard's body was treated according to his wishes. His heart was removed and buried at Rouen, the capital of Normandy. His entrails were buried at Charlus, near the site of his death. His body was taken to Fontevraud Abbey, where it was buried at the feet of his father Henry II. Eleanor would later be buried there as well, and the tombs of the Angevin kings can still be seen today, their stone effigies lying in silent repose. The news of Richard's death spread quickly across Europe. In England, there was mourning for the king who had been away so long, but who had still commanded the loyalty of his subjects. In France, there was celebration, for Philip knew that his greatest rival was gone, and that the way was now open for French expansion. In the Holy Land, there was sorrow, for the Crusaders remembered Richard as their champion, and knew that no one of his stature would come to their aid again. Richard's legacy was complex and contested from the very beginning. His admirers praised him as the greatest warrior of his age, a king who embodied the ideals of chivalry and crusade. His critics condemned him as a reckless adventurer who neglected his kingdom and squandered its resources on foreign wars. Both views contained elements of truth, and the debate over Richard's reputation has continued for more than 800 years. As a military commander, Richard was undoubtedly exceptional. He won battles against superior forces, captured castles that were thought to be impregnable, and inspired his men to feats of extraordinary courage. His understanding of strategy and tactics was sophisticated, and his personal bravery was legendary. Few medieval commanders could match his record of success, and his reputation as a warrior was fully deserved. As a king, Richard's record was more mixed. He spent only a few months of his reign in England, leaving the government in the hands of ministers while he pursued his wars abroad. He imposed heavy taxes on his subjects to fund his crusade and his ransom, creating resentments that would linger for years. He failed to produce an heir, leaving the succession uncertain and setting the stage for future conflicts. These failures would have significant consequences for the kingdom he left behind. Richard's crusade was both a triumph and a failure. He saved the crusader states from extinction and won famous victories against Saladin. But he did not recapture Jerusalem, the goal that had motivated the entire expedition. The holy city remained in Muslim hands, and it would never again be ruled by Christians. By the standards that Richard himself had set, the crusade fell short of success. The personal qualities that made Richard famous were both strengths and weaknesses. His courage inspired his followers, but also led him to take unnecessary risks. His pride made him a formidable opponent, but also made it difficult for him to compromise or cooperate with others. His generosity won him loyal supporters, but also depleted his treasury. Richard was a man of extremes, and his life reflected those extremes. Richard's impact on English history was significant, even though he spent so little time in the country. The ransom that his subjects paid for his release was one of the largest financial burdens ever imposed on the kingdom, and it forced the development of new systems of taxation that would shape English government for centuries. The legend of Richard as the ideal king, brave and just and true, became a powerful myth that influenced English national identity. The image of the Lionheart, sword in hand, became a symbol of English martial prowess.